Okay, so when I was 16, I was diagnosed with stage 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma that was localized to the upper left quadrant of my body. The treatment at the time for that was a combination of chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Now, I'm not blessed with particularly fantastic genetics when it comes to my venous system. So instead of administering the chemotherapy through my veins, the doctors advised that I had this implant put in just under my chest. It's called a vascular portacath. It's quite small. It's a ceramic device sort of about this big and about that deep. And it's connected up to a big vein in my shoulder. And so I received the chemotherapy treatment through that. I responded incredibly well to it. They were able to actually even cut the treatment short. And then I had a bout of radiotherapy from that, and I was sort of given the, not the complete all clear, but like this seems to be good enough from my doctors. So fast forward about a year from that, I was doing some backpacking in New Zealand, and I contracted this thing called the norovirus, which is sort of like this bad sort of like the worst gastro that you can possibly think of. And of course, I had a compromised immune system at this point, so I ended up being hospitalized for that. And so when they were trying to, I was so massively dehydrated because of this, they tried to pump fluids into me. They weren't able to do that, so they decided to try accessing this vascular portacath that I had in my chest. And it just wasn't working for one reason or another. So it's, you know, like any sort of implant that you have into your body, it never works quite perfectly like what's written on the box. So the tubing there sort of got a little bit of a kink in it, and when they were pushing fluid through it, it sort of felt like it was trying to burst through my chest. Sort of like that scene in Alien. So they weren't able to access it that way. So they ended up being able to find a vein eventually and pump me full of fluids. I recovered a couple of days later and came back to Australia. And the night that I came back, I received possibly some of the worst pain that I've ever felt in my entire life. So I quite literally thought that I was having a heart attack and that I was going to die. So I got myself to hospital as quickly as possible. And it turned out that I had these 2 pulmonary emboli, blood clots, that had been dislodged from this tubing, and they'd landed on my lung, and that was the thing that was giving me all this pain. So, you know, they'd been dislodged from this tubing, and they'd gone through my heart and got lodged. They got stuck in my lung. And so, from working that out, they decided that the corrective course of action there would be to remove that vascular portacath as quickly as possible, just in case there were other pulmonary embolisms that were sitting there. Very reasonable course of action, and they did it very, very quickly. From working out that was the source of the problem to it being removed from my body entirely, it took about 45 minutes. So pretty fantastic. Everything seemed to be okay. Then I had a bunch of like typical routine scans just a couple of weeks later, and I get this very hurried phone call from my oncologist saying, "You need to come in right now. We need to have a chat." No more details than that. And so I get into the office there, and my oncologist says, "I have some really bad news. When they were doing the removal procedure for the vascular portacath, they actually left a small amount of tubing, about a 2 centimetre piece of tubing within your body. And it wasn't just lodged anywhere within my body. It had actually taken the same path that those blood clots had. It had gone through the 2 chambers of my heart. It was now lodged between my heart and my lungs and my pulmonary vein. Pulmonary artery. And so the corrective action for that, there were basically three different options. The first was that we could just leave it there, and I stay on blood thinners for the rest of my life, which isn't exactly fantastic, but it's an option. The second option is that they crack my chest open, do a whole bunch of open heart surgery to try and extract it through there. I'll probably lose like maybe 60% of my lung capacity. There's about a 90% possibility that that would happen. And then the third option is that there would be some sort of like an angiogram where they basically take this little wire and they lasso it and they manage to pull it out. And while all of this is being told to me, the thing that comes to mind is what happened to the person that was performing the surgery in the first place? You know, what's stopping them from doing this to another person in the same sort of situation as me? And the answer that my oncologist told me was that, well, that's fine, we've actually handled that. He's not actually practicing medicine anymore. And so, to me, it sort of felt like, okay, well, that's pretty good. Like, he's obviously not going to be doing that sort of stuff to other people in the future. So then, fast forward to a couple of years ago, I was working for a managed hosting company in Australia, and I was the infrastructure and platforms lead for Movember. I don't know if you're familiar with Movember, but it's a men's health charity where men grow moustaches for the month of November. So you can actually start in just a couple of days, actually. And the money that's raised from that goes towards directly funding research into male depression and prostate cancer. So, it's a cause that's actually quite close to my heart. And so I was the infrastructure and platforms lead on that. And in the 2011 campaign, we had an absolute shocker of a year. We had long periods of downtime, multiple times. Basically, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Maybe not everything, but a lot of things went wrong. And towards the end of the campaign, we know that there are large numbers of donations that are going to come through towards, in that last sort of 3 to 5 days. And so as a preventative measure to stop the website going down during this period, during this peak donation period, we decided that we would add additional capacity to the database cluster that was there. And we were going to basically add 2 additional MySQL slave servers for read capacity. So I'm sitting there, very tired, very stressed, sort of at the end of my tether, and I have another colleague that's watching over my shoulder as we're doing this maintenance work, and we're trying to build up these 2 new servers from scratch, using, fortunately, all the config management stuff that we had in place. As we're doing it, we find that it's just not applying. It's not working in the way that we would expect it. So we're going through this constant cycle of running the config management, seeing if it works, testing it with the automated test suite, and then finding that it doesn't, running a command to remove all the changes that we've made, remove all the software, and start again. And so we're constantly working in this loop, right? And at one point in all of this, I accidentally ran a command, and I had somebody else that was watching over my shoulder as I was doing this, that unintentionally removed the database software, MySQL, off all nodes in the cluster, not just the 2 that I was working on. So at that point, the website went down. We weren't able to take donations. That was a pretty big deal. But fortunately, because of the way that we designed the systems and our incident response processes, we're actually able to get the website back up in about 90 seconds. So not too bad. And so at the end of this experience, when I'd had a bit of a moment to sort of to calm down and get away from the stress and the pressure of that Movember campaign, I started reflecting a little bit on the situation that I found myself in there versus what had happened to me and what had happened to this doctor, this surgeon, only sort of 5 or 6 years prior to that. And the thing that I sort of wanted to get a better handle of and understand was that, how I didn't get treated in a bad way by the organisation that I worked for. It was like, okay, well, you made a mistake and we're going to move on and things are going to be great. But I really wanted to understand, how our situations were actually different. What's different about what happened to both of us? And the conclusion that I sort of came to from that was the difference in our situations was how our organisations actually chose to respond to failure and error by the people, with the different people in the system. And so in most organisations, when there's some sort of failure tends to lead to blame. But then there's another class of organisations which I happily found myself in, where the failure actually leads to some sort of inquiry about all the different things that happened and why they happened and what made sense to the people that were operating the system at the time. And so we sort of have this old view in like a blameful type culture around human error, where we construct this narrative about what went wrong. And at the core of it is this concept of human error. And the problem with the narrative that we construct there with human error is that narrative that we're constructing is actually far worse than the reality of what went wrong. But we're so focused in this old world view of root cause, and the root cause is primarily driven by humans, right? And that's because we have bad apples within our systems, amoral actors that are actively working against us. And it's this reductionist down and in approach that leads us to finding this root cause human error within these organizations. But then you've got this whole idea of people or systems as well, where in the old view, the people and the systems are quite, they're distinct things. They're not sort of related to one another. So in this new world view of what happens when things go wrong within our organizations and the way that we choose to respond to that, we tend to think of it as in terms of people in systems, right? They're not separate things. They're not oil and water. We're all in this together. And we have this up and out approach to actually, to inquiring about what went wrong within our organizations. And we embrace the fundamental complexity of the situations that we find ourselves in. And this relates to this bigger picture idea of just culture, which there are plenty of other people that have talked about this at length. But just culture is fundamentally about embracing different perspectives, different stories, and different interests, and having the ability to be able to share that within your organization. As Niels Bohr said, we need many partially overlapping and somehow always contradictory descriptive layers to approximate a rendition of reality. And so in a just culture, where it's about creating an opportunity for learning from when things go wrong within our organizations. Whoa, what happened there? Sorry about that. My bad. I think my thing is just dead. Okay. Let's get rid of the clicker. So there are a couple of advantages of learning organizations. Firstly, you end up with high quality feedback from the front lines. It means that those people that are working in the organization can then focus on quality and on delivery. And it means that overall there's less defending of decisions when decisions are made and when those decisions possibly lead to some sort of adverse outcome. So I posit that there are three contributing factors that inhibit learning within most organizations. The first is blame, the second is language, and the third is sharing, and the learning that comes from a lack of sharing, or the learning that we get from actually doing the sharing in the first place. So let's talk for a minute about the language that we use. Now, this is primarily about language hacks that we can use within our organization on a day-to-day basis to minimize blame. So there's sort of this hierarchy of words where what is greater than how is greater than why is greater than who. And this is really about using words as framing devices when we talk about things that go wrong and also things that go right within our organizations. And these are words that we're using, during investigations, during retrospectives, learning reviews, brainstorming, postmortems. But also these are the words that we use on a day-to-day basis, just in conversations about how things are working, how things might work in the future, how things have worked in the past. So let's start with the worst, why. So why is fundamentally about justifying actions. Things like, why didn't you reboot those instances? Why didn't you check those backups? Why didn't you answer that page? And why is fundamentally about attribution and apportioning of blame towards people in our organizations. And it focuses this inquiry on people. And so you have this whole other idea of counterfactuals, which why is a fantastic way of triggering. So a counterfactual is basically a way that we talk about a past that never really actually happened. So examples of that are like, why didn't you answer the page? Why didn't you check the backups? And so when you're in like this blameless postmortem and you start throwing around the why question, this tends to be the reaction that you get from the people within that room, right? Because they think that they're actually going to have an open sharing type experience, and then they end up being ambushed with a whole bunch of why questions. And playing into why is this whole cognitive bias called the fundamental attribution error, which is really fascinating. So with the fundamental attribution error, we say that people's actions are explained by, other people's actions are explained by their personality, not the context that they find themselves in. However, when we judge our own actions in the past, we actually say that those actions can be explained by the context that we found ourselves in, not the innate sort of terms of our own personality. So let's talk about how, and how is really fantastic for articulating the mechanics of how a particular situation went down, what went wrong. So how did the site go down? How did the team react? And how is really fantastic because it's a useful tool for distancing people from the actions that they took in their situation. And it's also really fantastic for clarifying the technical details of like a chain of different events that happened that led up to a particular outcome. The one problem with how, though, is that it can sort of limit the scope of the inquiry overall. So the last word here that's really useful is what. Now, what is fundamentally about uncovering reasoning, understanding and building empathy for people within their situations. So, examples. What did you think was happening? What did you do next? What made the most sense? What was going through your mind at that time? What were you thinking about? And what is a fantastic tool for building empathy with actors in your complex systems, or more appropriately, it's about building empathy for people within your organizations. What is really fantastic as well, in that it encourages it encourages explaining in terms of foresight rather than hindsight. Not talking about justifying your actions, we're finding out what you were thinking at the time. And that feeds into this bigger picture idea of local rationality. And local rationality is that basically people make what they consider to be the best decisions given the information they have available to them at the time. So it's a concept from psychology, right? Now, you might notice that that's actually got a huge amount of overlap if you've ever done a retrospective before. There's a huge amount of overlap between the concept of local rationality and this retrospective prime directive here, right? And the great thing about, and the whole idea about using what to explain in terms of foresight, it's about understanding about what the people that were going through the tube at that particular point in time, that they were navigating that system, what made sense to them, why, what were the reasons that they decided to actually go forward and take those next steps rather than working backwards. And the thing that we tend to find with hindsight is that it gives us this very distorted view of the people within that system that are going down that tube, right? It distorts and taints all these interactions that we have. And fundamentally what we're trying to do is understand what the inside of the tunnel looked like to the people and the operators that found themselves in that situation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about blame. So blame is fundamentally about saying you or somebody within your organization was responsible for this particular failure. And you were responsible because you were neglectful, you were inattentive, you were derelict of duty. And again, it feeds into this idea of having bad apples, amoral actors within our complex systems. But the problem with that is that it ignores this fundamental truth about our organizations, which is that sometimes bad things happen and actually nobody is to blame. And following up from that, things tend to go right far more often than they actually go wrong. It just keeps going, trust me. And so we end up, it's really fundamentally about finger pointing, right, and saying that one particular person was responsible for this particular thing, bad thing that happened. So there are a couple of cognitive biases that are at play when it comes to blame and the construction of truth within our own organizations. So let's talk about what a cognitive bias is just for a moment, though. So a cognitive bias is basically a mental shortcut that your brain is taking because your brain is constantly optimizing for timeliness over the accuracy when it comes to processing new information. And so what's happening is that when your brain is processing all this information to do this problem solving, it's applying some sort of heuristic to the information, the input information that it's seeing. And that's resulting in, if it results in a correct result, we say that this is a rational choice. However, if it results in this incorrect result, we say that that's an example of a cognitive bias. And there are lots of these different heuristics that are at play here. But we're going to talk about two particular cognitive biases that have a huge impact on the way that we construct blame within our organizations. So heuristic, you might be asking though, it's just really about pattern matching, right, of all this information that's coming through. So what I want you all to do for a moment, bear with me here, is that there's going to be a team here, the team in white. I want you to count the number of times that you see them pass the ball. Okay, so for people who haven't completed this exercise before, quickly shout out how many times you thought you saw the ball passed.
40. 23.
Okay, that's a lot of numbers. So I heard like 12, 14, 23, that sort of thing. Okay, great. So did you also notice the moonwalking bear in the middle of all of that? Right. So this is a stunning example of this thing called the confirmation bias, where we are constantly seeking information that reinforces an existing pre-held view about the world and the way that things actually work. And we also, because of the confirmation bias, tend to ignore alternative explanations for how things played out, what went wrong. And even worse, we actually tend to interpret ambiguous information in favor of the existing assumptions that we have about the way that the world works. So you're probably all familiar with this guy, but this is Stephen Colbert. So he played a fictional version of himself on Comedy Central in the show called The Colbert Report. And basically, he basically created this sort of fictionalized conservative pundit that was actually sort of sending up the conservative political establishment in the United States. But the one interesting thing about Stephen Colbert is that there's actually tons of people that genuinely believe that he was a real conservative pundit, because that was the information that they were seeking out in the first place. And there's a bunch of studies that actually show that there's quite a large number of people that are affected by this. So there are a couple of things that we can do to counter this behavior within our organizations. So firstly, we can take opposing viewpoints and appoint somebody to actually take those opposing viewpoints when we're having these conversations about what went wrong. So there are a bunch of studies in stock markets and high-frequency traders that actually found that investors who had like a sparring session before, at the beginning or the end of every day, and there was somebody that was appointed to sort of to put forward the contrarian arguments. Actually, those teams of stockbrokers actually had higher performance overall because they'd actually done the legwork, the mental legwork, to actually justify their position in one form or another. The other interesting thing to consider with the confirmation bias is that if your conclusion is negative, there's a very, very real possibility that that it's actually biased, that the confirmation bias is at play here. Okay, so great if my computer would one day work. Here we go. No, there we go. Perfect. So imagine that you're woken up in the middle of the night by this monitoring alert for back-end HTTP port 81. What does that even mean? Right. But you know that, well, actually, I don't want that thing that woke me up last night to wake me up again, right? Because it turned out that monitoring alert was actually completely useless in the first place. It wasn't actionable. There wasn't any sort of run sheet. There wasn't any sort of context that was associated with it. It had just sort of been thrown out there, and you were dealing with with the result of that. So you don't want that thing that woke you up last night to wake you up again, right? And so you're going to make that problem go away. But interesting questions. How often does that alert actually fire? What percentage of all alerts is that? Are there any other alerts within your monitoring system that are actually firing more frequently, but you're not paying attention to them because they're not the most painful thing to you at this particular moment in time? What makes that one particular alert the most important one to fix? So this is an example of the hindsight bias here, the knew it all along effect, where we basically it's a type of memory distortion where we form a judgment about something. We know the outcome, and so we rewrite our recollection of memories to say that you were responsible for this failure because you were neglectful, inattentive, derelict of duty. And so we alter these memories when we're recalling them, and we're altering the way that we actually perceived ourselves to be reacting to those situations when we found ourselves in them, because we're saying that this is the most important thing at this particular moment in time. And the real problem, the fundamental problem with the hindsight bias is that we end up talking about events with the knowledge of the outcome, not the knowledge that we had at the time when we were going through that tunnel. So again, asking the question, what percentage of all alerts is this? Well, if we actually look here at a table form that you totally can't see up the back because of the wonderful contrast on this projector, that monitoring alert is all the way down here at the bottom, right? It's like the third lowest out of all the monitoring alerts that we have here. But we've got the data, we can analyze that. but we choose not to because of the hindsight bias. So again, what makes that particular alert the most important one to fix? But in the context of having these conversations, these investigations, these post-mortems, the hindsight bias fundamentally taints all the interactions that we have with other people in our own teams, but also the other teams that we find ourselves working in our organizations. So you see an example here of like the Asiana flight that crashed at San Francisco airport back in 2013, right? You see these newspaper headlines just literally hours or sometimes days after these particular events unfolded. And here, we're attributing and apportioning blame to the people that found themselves in that system, right? The pilots, they were the ones that were responsible because, they were inexperienced and they were staying silent. And, actually, there's a broader systemic problem here of like, pilots as a whole are actually, their skills are eroding, so they're actually putting us all at risk here. But this is a very common narrative that we find, and it's a great way to sensationalize the story and add a little bit of drama to it, rather than actually understanding what really went wrong in these situations. So the hindsight bias is your culture killer within your organization, and it's really important that you try to relentlessly eliminate the hindsight bias that you find creeping into your organization. So the good news about the hindsight bias, though, is that there are actually ways that we can harness that behavior to get some really great stuff out of it. So before you do some sort of launch of a major feature and you pull all the different people that are responsible for that together, and you pose the question, okay, we're about to launch, what are the things that you actually think are going to break, right? So you do that exercise, and then you go, okay, so we've done the launch now, and imagine 5 minutes after we've done the launch, what's the thing that's actually just broken? So by flipping it on its head and putting ourselves in the future and look back, we actually come up with a whole bunch of different, and sometimes quite significantly different, predictions about what's actually going to go wrong. So you can actually use the hindsight bias as a little bit of a predictive tool, which is quite neat. And there are also some other things that we can do to counter this behavior within our organization. So firstly, you want to try from the very beginning to explain everything that's happening in terms of foresight. Again, the concept of local rationality. People make what they consider to be the best decision given the information available to them at the time. So the last part here is sharing, right? So sharing is about embracing these different perspectives, these different stories, these different interests that we have of people within our organizations. And we do that through these investigations, retrospectives, also the conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis, right? But the really important thing when we're conducting these sort of exercises where people are given the opportunity to be able to talk about what went wrong and their personal experiences, their personal lived experiences, is that these environments, it's paramount that these environments are incredibly safe. So there's no fear of any sort of repercussion for the people to find themselves divulging information that may perhaps reflect badly on them. So if you're in some sort of management or leadership position, it really means that you need to try and be the shit umbrella that you want to see in the rest of the world, right? You want to shield the people that are underneath you that are bearing their experience and telling you things that normally they wouldn't feel safe to do. If they're doing that and they're going out on a limb and they're doing that, you need to be able to stand up and actually protect them from any sort of outcome, any sort of repercussion from that. Again, because people make what they consider to be the best decisions, blah, 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 blah. But the retrospective prime directive here is a really fantastic way of actually framing that in the first place. Consider even just putting it at like the top of your report that you output so that it sets the scene for the people that are going to be reading that report at the end of that entire investigation cycle. And what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to navigate this gap, this quite significant chasm between the way that we imagine that work is completed within our organizations versus how it is actually performed at the front lines by the people that are doing it. Right? Quite often there's quite a significant gap between those two different things. And again, as Niels Bohr said, so you might be wondering what happened. I sort of left it a little bit of a cliffhanger at the beginning there. What happened about the tubing that I had stuck inside of me? So we ended up opting for the third option, which was to do this angiogram. And so I got scheduled in for this procedure. And basically, I'm completely doped up with pain meds because they actually inject this, well, they basically open up my, they stick this big needle into my femoral artery in my leg, and they thread through the needle this angiogram wire, and there's a whole bunch of blood, and I'm totally doped up because of all of this. But the crazy thing about it is, as they're threading this wire all the way through me, I can see all of this happening in real time because it's basically like this live X-ray. So I'm exposed to huge amounts of radiation. It's fantastic. And so all of the other people that are around me, to give you an idea of just how much radiation, all the other people that are around me are like dressed head to toe in like these lead-lined suits. So I'm sure it's going to have all sorts of wonderful complications later on down the line. Anyway, they access and they're pushing this angiogram wire all the way up my body, and they basically push it all the way through these two chambers of my heart. And they deploy this little lasso, and they manage to lasso the tube, and they can see it, quite clearly on this monitor. And I'm seeing all this, and it was like, holy crap! I can totally feel this in my heart. Really weird. And so, they pull it through, and it actually gets stuck in one of these chambers of my heart, and then it gets flushed all the way back out again. So they try again the second time. They manage to lasso it, and they pull it all the way through the different chambers of my heart. And they pull it out, and fantastic, great news, I don't have this thing in me. But cool fact, here we go. Actually ended up being this. It was 12 centimeters of tubing, not 2 centimeters of tubing, as was displayed. Right. I've got this at home, by the way. Bring it out at parties. It's a laugh. And you might be saying, well, that's great. That was life and death. That's an awesome little story. But, what happened with the surgeon was a completely different thing to, you taking a men's health charity website offline for 90 seconds in the peak donation period. Well, the thing that I want you to think about there is that there are two factors here. Firstly, the punishment that was meted out to the surgeon that performed that action was done before the actual full length of that tubing was known. And secondly, we also know in very real terms how much the Movember downtime costs. So you have to ask the question, what are the research programs that were cut because of that lack of donations that we've got there? How much further are we away from actually finding the cure to prostate cancer? And so this is why it's so important within our organizations to go up and out and actually understand the relationships, the different things that happen. And we do that by conducting these investigations, these retrospectives, and just having plain old conversations about what went wrong in very plain, simple terms. We have to start at the beginning. We have to talk about it in terms of foresight. And we use the tools because what is greater than how, rather than using why and who. We have to relentlessly eliminate this hindsight bias when we're performing these actions, when we're performing these retrospectives, because within our organizations, things go right far more often than they actually go wrong. And we owe it to the people that we work with to find out what made the course of action the right one when they found themselves in that situation. I'm Lindsay Homewood, Oxesis on Twitter, and thank you very much. All right, do you have any questions? Yes?
Did you consider asking the doctors to call in the surgeon they fired to fix his problem, his mistake?
Yeah, so the question was, did I consider calling the doctors to get them to bring the surgeon back in? So at what point in time? You mean after I came to this stunning realization around human error, or around, at the time where, back when I was 16 years old?
After your experience.
After my experiences? No, and actually that's a really good point. I think I should probably do that. Yeah. Maybe I could give this talk to them. I don't know. More questions? Yes, Bridget.
You mentioned the quantifying of the impact of the downtime. Have you worked in organizations that do try to unspiral all of the things that may have happened or definitely happened because of a downtime, and they consider that? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, have I worked in an organization or been part of a team that's tried to deconstruct the, I guess, the financial and the human impact of what happens when things go wrong? Yeah, I can say that we definitely did that when the Movember incident went down. So, I mean, we knew in very real dollar terms at different points of the campaign just how much we were expecting to be getting from that. You know, I think at that point, the Movember folk were probably just feeling a little bit sorry for us because it was really relentless. Like they didn't want to really push too hard, but we had a considerable amount of downtime during that campaign. So, you know, at that point, it's like that thing, right, where if you overwork yourself too much, there are plenty of studies that show that your actual performance, if you're working, you know, like 12, 14, 16-hour days, drops off quite significantly after about the third day, right? And so I'd been doing that for 33 days straight at that point. So, you know, there's going to be mistakes that are going to slip in, right?
Cool. Sounds like spoilers for your panel later.
Yeah, perhaps. That is, yeah, so that's a good point. So I'm talking on a panel about burnout in tech. So I'm giving that after lunch, so you should totally come to that. Any more questions? Yes? What was the root cause? The root of the outage?
What would you change to prevent it?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So I guess there are many contributing factors at play rather than a single root cause. But if we're going to talk about some of the contributing factors there, yeah, definitely fatigue was the number one. The drift in, well, I guess the lack of automated builds of certain parts of the infrastructure that were leading to the need to actually do manual intervention in the first place. It was a far more successful campaign as well than what we actually anticipated. You know, in that year we over doubled the number of donations that we were experiencing in that period of time. Yeah. All right. Here we go. Over there. Yep.
Encountered people that don't buy into this might change the culture and make the learning kind of organisation. And if so, what did you do? How did you get on board?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I got a little bit frazzled before and I skipped a bunch of slides. And so I actually addressed exactly that. So, know the audience of your report is actually really, really important. So I've worked in teams before where we've done this sort of blameless postmortem thing. We've taken the new world view of human error and how systems fail, how complex systems fail, and the interaction that we have there. And probably like the worst case of that being misinterpreted is that we put together a bunch of different contributing factors and a bunch of artifacts that sort of were remediation techniques and actions and things that we can do to actually improve the situation. And the problem analyses that were sent out to the end customer quite literally read root cause human error. So, you know, even within the broader organization that I found myself in, you know, I'd sort of built up this pocket of resistance that was thinking about things in this brand new way, but it definitely wasn't evenly distributed. So, you know, it's really important that you know the audience of the report. We sort of, you know, it was a learning experience for all of us as well because we were writing this report in this style in one of the first ways, like one of the first examples of us using this particular style. So I would sort of argue that consider actually constructing multiple reports for the different audiences that you've got. So you've got a report that's focused primarily for the engineering side of the organization, another report maybe exclusively for the executives and a little bit of the management. If your organization is large enough, you know, maybe consider doing, you know, different reports for different teams. Like the recount and the explanation and the narrative that you're finding for the event is probably, I would argue that it probably needs to be identical across all these different reports. But include varying levels of detail, right? And, you know, have these conversations with people about these broader things that are at play. You know, trying to sort of ram it through and go, yeah, you know, we're taking the new worldview of looking at human error and talking about, you know, blameless postmortems and that sort of thing. And you don't provide context to other people within your organization, then you're going to lose every single time. Right? You've got to win hearts and minds. All right, I think I've got time for one more question. Or no more questions. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Have a great day.